He spent 16 years trying to return to America. In the end, America only took him back when he was dead. January 26, 1962, Naples International Airport, Italy. Lucky Luciano, 64 years old, walked through the terminal toward a meeting that had been months in the making. Martin Gosh, a Hollywood producer, had flown from America to discuss a film about Luciano's life, a movie. Somebody wanted to put his story on screen, wanted to capture in celluloid the 50 years of survival, strategy, empire building, and exile that had defined one of the most remarkable lives in American criminal history. The irony was almost too perfect. The man who had been banned from America, who had spent 16 years watching his country from across an ocean, was finally being sought out by Hollywood, the dream factory, the myth-making machine at the heart of American culture, not for justice, not for punishment, for storytelling, because even his enemies could no longer deny that what Lucky Luciano had lived was worth telling. He never got to hear the producer's full pitch. Somewhere in that conversation, surrounded by the noise and movement of an Italian airport, Lucky Luciano's heart gave out. He collapsed on the floor of the arrivals hall. By the time help arrived, he was gone. The man who had survived 50 stab wounds, gang wars, prosecution, imprisonment, deportation, and 16 years of exile couldn't survive 64 years of living. They shipped his body back to New York. It was the only way he ever came home. But the real story was never only about the ending. To understand those final 16 years, you need to understand what deportation truly meant to Lucky Luciano. He hadn't been born in America. He'd arrived from Sicily as a 9-year-old boy in 1906. But America was the only world he'd ever really known. The Lower East Side streets where he'd grown up, the New York neighborhoods where he'd built his empire, the language, the culture, the particular energy of American cities, all of it was his, more deeply embedded in who he was than any legal paperwork could determine. Italy was supposed to be home. It was his country of birth, his parents' country, the place his immigrant identity was rooted in. But when he arrived in Naples in February 1946, he discovered the painful truth that immigrants who leave too young often learn eventually. You can't truly go home to a place that was never really yours. He'd left Sicily as a child. He didn't know Italy as an adult. The language felt foreign, the customs felt distant, and the country itself seemed to regard him as an American problem that had been dumped on Italian soil. He was nobody's citizen, too American for Italy, too criminal for America. What happened next changed the meaning of everything that came before. The early years of exile were defined by restlessness. Luciano couldn't accept that it was over. He tried every available legal channel to challenge his deportation, to argue that he'd served his sentence, cooperated with the government during the war, and earned the right to return. His lawyers filed motions. His allies lobbied politicians. His wartime cooperation with naval intelligence was cited as evidence of patriotism and service. Every attempt failed. The U.S. government was immovable. They had deported Lucky Luciano, and they intended to keep him deported. The precedent was too important. The political symbolism too significant. Allowing the most famous gangster in America to return after deportation would undermine every deportation order the government issued. So the lawyers were rebuffed, the motions were denied, and Lucky Luciano remained in Italy. The Cuba experiment, moving his headquarters to Havana in 1946, staying for months before being expelled at American pressure, demonstrated both his defiance and its limits. He could operate near America but not in it. He could maintain connections but not presence. He could influence but not command. And when even Cuba was closed to him, he returned to Italy with the final knowledge that the Western Hemisphere itself had been made inaccessible. Naples became his permanent home. He settled into a life that was, by most external measures, comfortable. He had money, the financial structures he'd built continued generating income. He had connections, the families he'd organized still respected and consulted him. He had his name, his reputation, the accumulated weight of a legacy that made him someone important even in exile. But he didn't have New York, and that absence was its own kind of wound. The confidence in his presence did not mean certainty existed within him. Life in Naples had its compensations. The city was beautiful, the weather mild, the food extraordinary. Luciano settled into routines that would have seemed impossibly domestic for the man who'd once run organized crime from Manhattan hotel suites. He ate at the same restaurants. He walked the same streets. He had a circle of associates, some connected to the Italian underworld, others simply the kind of people who gravitated toward a man of his reputation and resources. He had relationships with women, though never the lasting domestic partnership that might have provided deeper comfort. He had Italian mob connections who treated him with respect, recognizing both his legend and his ongoing influence over American organized crime. And he had Mayor Lansky, always Lansky. Messages traveled back and forth across the Atlantic constantly, business updates, personal news, the ongoing thread of a friendship that exile couldn't sever. Frank Costello visited when he could. Other associates made the trip to Naples. American organized crime maintained its connection to its exiled architect, treating him with the respect due to a founder even as the day-to-day operations had long since passed to other hands. He was consulted on major decisions. His opinion still carried weight in commission discussions. Consulting is not the same as deciding. Advising is not the same as commanding. And watching your empire continue without you, however successfully, carries its own particular pain. He had built something that outlasted his direct control, which was exactly what he'd intended. The problem was that success of that kind doesn't provide the satisfaction of ongoing purpose, but there was something no one around him could fully understand. The attempts to return never fully stopped. They became less frequent, less optimistic, more resigned over the years. But there were still conversations with lawyers about changed political circumstances, still hope that a different administration might see things differently, still the human refusal to fully accept permanent separation from the place you considered home. He watched America from across the ocean as it changed dramatically through the 1950s, television transforming culture, the Cold War reshaping politics, rock and roll replacing the jazz he'd grown up with. The organized crime world he'd created being documented in Senate hearings, analyzed by journalists, the subject of endless public fascination. His own name appearing constantly in books, articles, and eventually television programs about the mafia. He was famous in exile. Perhaps more famous than he'd been when operating. The myth-making that happens when a powerful figure is removed from the scene had transformed Lucky Luciano from a criminal boss into a cultural symbol. The newspapers wrote about him, the true crime writers analyzed him. The Senate investigators held him up as the example of what organized crime had become. And through it all, he sat in Naples, reading reports about himself as if they described someone else. He built a world that looked controlled, even while carrying burdens no one could see. The 1950s brought additional pressure. The Kefauver Committee's televised investigations into organized crime made the mafia a subject of national conversation in America. Names that had been known only in criminal circles, Costello, Genovese, Anastasia, were suddenly household words. And Luciano's name appeared constantly in the testimony and documentation, as the architect of modern organized crime, the man who'd created the structures being investigated. He was both absent and omnipresent, physically removed from America, but central to every serious discussion of what organized crime had become. The Kefauver investigators couldn't touch him, but they couldn't ignore him either. His influence was documented even as he remained unreachable in Italy. And then came the Appalachian disaster of 1957. Vito Genovese's overreach, calling a national meeting of crime bosses at a private estate in upstate New York that was raided by police, exposed the existence of organized crime's national coordination in ways that couldn't be denied or dismissed. It was exactly the kind of thing Luciano would never have allowed, too public, too visible, too arrogant in its assumption that power could operate without discretion. From Naples, watching the coverage, Luciano must have felt the particular frustration of seeing the structures he'd carefully built being damaged by people who didn't understand why those structures required subtlety. He'd spent his career making organized crime invisible where it mattered. Genovese had put it on the front page of every newspaper in America. The image was real, so was the silence afterward. As the 1950s ended and the 1960s began, Luciano was 63 years old and feeling it. The exile had worn on him in ways that didn't always show externally but manifested in quieter moments. The energy that had made him formidable was dimming. The network of relationships that had sustained him was thinning as contemporaries aged, retired, died, or went to prison. The world he'd built was changing in ways he couldn't fully direct from across an ocean. Mayor Lansky was still there, still loyal, still in contact, still managing Luciano's financial interests with the same precision he'd always brought. Their correspondence remained active, business matters mixed with personal news, the ongoing dialogue of two men who'd known each other for 45 years and had built something extraordinary together. When historians later pieced together Luciano's exile years, Lansky's loyalty was consistently one of the few constants. There were also attempts to leave some kind of record, conversations with associates that would later be reconstructed by biographers, hints at cooperation with writers who wanted to document his life, the awareness growing as he aged that whatever his legacy would be, it would be written by others, and there was value in having at least some input into that narrative. What people called legendary often began as something deeply personal. The approach of Martin Gosch in late 1961 fit that pattern. Gosch was a legitimate Hollywood producer with serious credits who wanted to make a film about Luciano's life. He traveled to Italy, met with Luciano, and began discussions about the project. They met multiple times over months. Luciano apparently cooperated with Gosch's research, sharing stories, providing context, helping reconstruct a life that had been lived largely in shadows. The meetings represented something meaningful beyond the business proposition. They were a form of legacy making. A chance for Luciano to have some control over how his story would be told, to ensure that the complexity of his life, the immigrant ambition, the strategic genius, the organizational innovation, the exile and loss, would be part of the record rather than just the crime and violence that headlines always emphasized. Whether he saw the film as potential vindication, artistic legacy, or simple business opportunity isn't clear. What's clear is that he was engaged with the project, taking it seriously, and that their January 26, 1962 meeting at the airport was intended to advance discussions that both men believed had real value. Many knew the legend, the most powerful gangster in America, the architect of modern organized crime, the exile king of Naples, but very few understood the hunger that built it and the grief that sustained him through 16 years of separation from everything he'd built. The immigrant kid who'd come to America seeking something better and found it, then had it taken away not by failure but by the excess of success. That hunger came from somewhere much deeper, from the knowledge growing clearer each year that the place you made yourself, the streets where you built your identity, the city that shaped everything you became, that place defines you even when it rejects you. New York was in Luciano in ways that Naples never could be, and the distance between where he lived and where he belonged was a wound that 16 years of comfortable exile couldn't heal. The real story was never only about the death at the airport. It was about what that death represented. The full circle of an immigrant life born in Sicily, died in Italy, with everything that mattered concentrated in the America between. The man who reshaped American organized crime couldn't reshape his own ending. After all the strategy, all the calculation, all the structures built to survive every contingency, his heart simply stopped in an airport arrivals hall while he waited to discuss a movie. His body was returned to New York for burial, St. John's Cemetery in Queens. Thousands attended his funeral, old associates, family members, representatives of the families he'd organized, and ordinary people who understood that whatever else he was, Lucky Luciano had been a force that shaped the American century. Frank Costello was there, Mayor Lansky was there. The men who'd been part of his world came to say goodbye in the city he'd been forbidden to enter while alive. It was the only way he ever came home, the only return America allowed him. A coffin and a funeral, the city opening its gates for the man it had expelled only when he could no longer threaten anyone. The confidence in his presence did not mean certainty existed within him. The irony of Lucky Luciano's death echoes through everything he built and everything he lost. He'd spent his career creating structures that couldn't be destroyed by removing any single individual. The commission survived his imprisonment. The family survived his deportation. His influence persisted through exile. He'd succeeded in making himself, in a structural sense, unnecessary, which was the point, the proof of the organizational genius he'd developed from Arnold Rothstein's teachings. But in doing so, he'd made himself dispensable in ways that hurt. The empire continued without him. The decisions got made without him. The city he'd shaped continued shaping itself without his hand guiding it. He'd built something that outlasted him, which is what he'd intended. He just expected to watch it from closer range. The 16 years in Naples were neither triumph nor defeat. They were simply the final chapter of a life that had been extraordinary in its ambition, its violence, its organizational genius, and its human cost. A kid from Sicily came to New York and built something that reshaped American criminal history. Then America decided he'd built too well and sent him back to where he came from. He tried to return for 16 years. He never made it. And when his heart stopped in that Naples airport, the last conversation he was having was about telling his own story, trying to ensure that the record included something more than the crime and punishment that law enforcement wanted to define him by. He died as he'd lived, thinking about legacy, managing narrative, trying to control the story even when control was slipping away. Lucky Luciano, born Salvatore Lucania in Lercara Fritti, Sicily, 1897. Died Charles Luciano in Naples, Italy, 1962, buried in St. John's Cemetery, Queens, New York, the only return his country allowed him. He came to America as a boy and gave it everything he had. America gave him a legacy and took away his home. He spent 16 years trying to reclaim it and died trying. In the end, the only way home was in a coffin, and even then, America made him wait.